The instructor laughed at human endurance, then the Deathworld storm. Hit instructor Kellen Roas liked clean lessons. He liked drills that ended on time, debriefs that fit on one screen, and cadets who failed in predictable ways. He was a veteran of 3 campaigns and 2 peacekeeping rotations, and he carried his confidence the way others carried sidearms. Visible. Ready. The Academy had assigned him to Field Exercise 12 on Kestrel 4, a hostile planet used for live training, because it punished mistakes without needing to pretend. Kestrel 4 was classified as a death world by several council standards. The air was breathable but harsh. The terrain shifted. Weather did not respect forecasts. That was why the Academy used it. Roas stood at the edge of the landing zone with a slate in one hand and a dry smile on his face. 30 cadets lined up in mixed formation, wearing field suits and carrying packs. Their helmets reflected the pale sky. Behind them, the dropship waited with its ramp down, engines idling. Roas paced in front of them. "Objective," he said. "Traverse from this zone to the extraction marker 40 kilometers east. You have 2 days. You will build shelters, manage supplies, maintain comms, and keep your team alive." He paused, letting the words settle. "This is not a race," he added. "It is a competence check." A few cadets straightened. Roas tapped his slate and projected a weather graph into the air. "Forecast," he said. "Moderate winds, night cold, no major fronts expected." Then he looked toward the human contingent. There were 2 humans in the formation, both male, both in plain gear, no visible augmentations. One was tall and broad, with close-cut hair and a steady stare. His name tag read Mason Carter. The other was leaner, eyes calm, jaw set like he had decided long ago not to waste words. His tag read Luke Navarro. Roas had read their files. High endurance scores, high pain tolerance, strong completion rates. In prior exercises, the Academy loved to talk about humans as if they were built for suffering. Roas had heard the stories. Humans walking wounded, humans holding positions without sleep, humans surviving conditions that broke others. He had also seen humans fail like everyone else when systems went wrong. He stopped in front of Mason and tilted his head. "Human endurance," Roas said loud enough for the whole line to hear. "The famous myth." A few cadets glanced sideways. Roas smiled. "I have read the reports. I have seen the old videos. Humans love to tell each other they are special." Mason did not react. Luke did not blink. Roas continued. "Out here, endurance is not legend. It is logistics. It is heat management. It is shelter. It is planning. If you think stubbornness will replace preparation, you will learn something painful." A Veskri cadet snorted in approval. Roas let the smile widen into a short laugh. "It is a nice story," he said. "The unstoppable, human." He looked at Mason again. "Try not to bleed on my evaluation forms." Mason answered in a flat tone. "Yes, sir." Roas turned away, satisfied. He did not hate humans. He simply disliked myths. Myths made cadets careless. He raised his hand. "Move out," he said. The formation broke into teams. Each team carried a beacon, a map unit, and limited supplies. They had water filters, ration packs, 2 thermal sheets, and a compact shelter kit that could be assembled into a low dome. Roas walked behind them, with 2 assistant instructors, watching their spacing and their pace. The land beyond the landing zone was a field of dark scrub and fractured stone. Patches of sharp grass grew in clumps. The ground held shallow holes that could break an ankle if you were not watching. The first hours went smoothly. Teams established a steady pace. Packs shifted. Cadets breathed hard but controlled. Mason and Luke were assigned to different teams by design. The Academy liked to see if humans improved group survival, or only their own. Mason's team moved with quiet efficiency. He adjusted straps for a smaller cadet without being asked. He pointed out a safe route around a loose slope. He did not talk much. Luke's team was faster, but Luke kept them from burning out by forcing breaks before anyone asked for one. Roas watched both and felt his earlier amusement hold. They were competent. So were many species. By late afternoon, clouds began to form low on the western horizon. Roas checked his slate. Forecast still showed no front. He frowned slightly. The air pressure shifted in a way he could feel in his ears. Kestrel 4 did not care about forecasts. He made a note to accelerate shelter construction that night. They reached the first planned rest site near a shallow ravine with scattered boulders. Roas called a halt. "Shelter's up," he said. 2 hours, then rest cycle. Cadets moved quickly, unrolling kits, anchoring stakes, layering thermal sheets. Rose walked between teams, inspecting knots and seal lines. Mason's team had their dome up early, low profile, reinforced with stone. Luke's team positioned theirs behind a windbreak and dug a shallow trench to channel runoff. Roas nodded despite himself. Then he heard it. A distant sound, low and constant, like a heavy engine running far away. Several cadets looked up. The clouds in the west were no longer clouds. They were a wall. Roas stared at it, then at his slate. The forecast graph froze for a second, then updated. Severe front. Wind escalation. Electrostatic particulate storm. Impact debris risk. His mouth went dry. That storm was not supposed to be here. It was moving fast, too fast. Assistant Instructor Sarev approached, voice tight. "We need to pull back to the drop ship." Roas looked at the sky. They were too far now. They would not outrun it. He made the decision that felt correct in training manuals and wrong in his gut. "Shelters hold," he said. "Reinforce. Low. Profile. Everyone inside in 5. Cadets rushed. The first gust hit before the last team sealed their dome. It came from the west, like a slap. The ravine filled with dust. Stones clattered. One shelter pole snapped with a sharp crack. Then the storm arrived, not as wind, as force. The air turned brown and loud. Grit hammered against fabric and visors. Larger debris struck the boulders with heavy impacts. Roas shouted orders that no one could hear. The shelters buckled one by one. Anchors pulled. Fabric tore. Poles bent. A dome lifted, rolled, and vanished into the dust. A cadet screamed through the comms. Roas saw shapes stumbling in the open, knocked off their feet by gusts strong enough to lift a grown body. His plan was gone in seconds. Shelter was gone. Forecast was irrelevant. The exercise had become a real survival event. Through the noise, Roas saw Mason Carter moving, not running blind, moving with purpose, head down, one arm hooked around a smaller cadet, dragging him. Behind a boulder, Luke Navarro was doing the same on the other side of the ravine, pulling a fallen Veskri upright and forcing him to crawl. Roas stood in the open for one moment too long, slate useless in his hand, and realized the myth he had laughed at was about to become the only thing that mattered. The Deathworld storm hit, and the humans did not stop. The storm erased distance. What had been a ravine became a moving wall of grit and noise. Visibility dropped to arm length. The wind did not howl. It pressed, constant and heavy, like the planet itself leaning in. Roas tried to issue commands through his comm. Static answered him. The signal cut in and out, fragments of panic and half-words bleeding through. He tasted dust inside his helmet. A shape slammed into him, and he went down hard, shoulder striking stone. Pain flared bright. His slate skidded away and vanished into the brown haze. He pushed himself up and immediately lost his footing again. This was not a drill anymore. This was not something he could pace and correct. He saw Mason again, closer now, moving at a diagonal across the wind rather than against it. Mason had one hand gripping a cadet's harness and the other pressed against the ground, using the boulder line as a guide. Roas realized something with a cold clarity. The humans were not trying to hold position. They were relocating. Luke Navarro appeared out of the dust on the far side, signaling with his arm rather than comms. He pointed toward the ravine wall, where a narrow cut in the stone formed a partial overhang. It was not shelter in the academy sense. It was cover. Luke shoved 2 cadets into it, then turned back into the storm without hesitation. Roas watched him disappear and felt something twist in his chest. He forced himself to crawl toward the overhang, using hands and knees because standing meant being knocked flat again. A cadet collided with him, wide-eyed and shaking. Roas grabbed the cadet's suit and pulled him close. "Follow the rock!" he shouted, knowing the words would be swallowed. He pointed instead. The cadet nodded and crawled. By the time Roas reached the overhang, Mason was already there, braced against the stone, holding another cadet in place while Luke packed loose rubble into the gap to narrow the opening. They were not talking. They did not need to. They were building something that would last just long enough. Another shelter fragment slammed nearby and shattered. Luke looked at Roas through his visor and made a sharp downward motion with his hand. Get low. Roas obeyed without thinking. The storm intensified. Small debris turned to larger impacts. The rock above them vibrated. Dust poured in through every crack. A cadet began to sob, a high broken sound over the comms. Mason reached over and gripped the cadet's shoulder hard. Not gentle, not cruel. The sobbing stopped. Minutes passed, or seconds. Time lost meaning in the noise. The overhang held, but barely. Wind funneled through the gap and threatened to rip them out like loose cargo. Luke shifted position and wedged his pack into the opening, using his body to keep it from tearing free. Roas saw blood bead where Luke's glove tore against the stone. Luke did not look at it. Another cadet tried to stand. Mason yanked him down and shook his head once, slow and firm. Stay. Roas understood then. The humans were not enduring the storm. They were managing it. They watched the rhythm of the gusts and moved only in the lulls. They conserved energy. They controlled panic. They turned pain into something background and irrelevant. Roas had taught theory like this. He had never seen it executed under real pressure. The storm lasted longer than any forecast Roas had ever seen. When it finally began to weaken, it did not fade. It loosened, gust by gust, like a grip slowly releasing. Luke was the first to test the open air. He crawled out, pressed flat, then signaled back. Mason followed, then helped the others. One by one, Roas was last. When he crawled free, his muscles trembled, and his confidence lay somewhere far behind him in the dust. The landscape was unrecognizable. Shelters were gone. Equipment scattered or buried. The ravine was half filled with debris. The extraction marker was still 40 kilometers away. Night was coming. Roas stood there, breathing hard, and finally looked at Mason and Luke not as cadets, but as the only reason anyone was still alive. He opened his mouth to speak, then stopped. There was no lesson he could give right now. Only one he had to learn. The storm left damage behind that did not look dramatic. That was the problem. No flames, no craters, just subtle changes that turned simple movement into a test of judgment. The ravine floor was buried under a shifting layer of dust and stone. What had been solid footing was now unstable. Every step threatened to slide. Roas tried to stand fully and nearly went down again. Mason caught his arm without a word and guided him back to a crouch. Luke was already moving through the scattered gear, checking what remained usable. He shook his head once, then twice. Shelter kits destroyed. One water filter cracked. 2 ration packs lost. Comms still unreliable. Night approaching fast. Rose felt the weight of responsibility settle in his chest. This was his exercise. His call had put them here. He forced himself to speak, keeping his voice steady. We need to consolidate and reassess. Luke looked at him, visor smeared with dust. We need to move. Roas hesitated. In this terrain. Mason answered instead, calm and direct. If we stop, we freeze. Temperature drop is coming. Roas checked his suit display. External temperature was already falling faster than expected. The storm had stripped heat from the ground. Night on Kestrel 4 was brutal even on a good day. He nodded once. Lead. That was the moment Roas knew something fundamental had changed. He was no longer instructing. It was following. Luke took point, not because he was fastest, but because he watched the ground like it might betray him. He tested each step before committing weight. Mason stayed in the rear, counting heads, adjusting packs, forcing brakes before anyone collapsed. Rose moved in the middle, helping where he could, learning more in silence than he ever had from reports. They did not head straight for the extraction marker. Luke angled them slightly north, following a line of darker stone that would hold heat longer after sunset. Basalt, he said when Roas glanced at him. Better than dust. The group moved slowly. A Veskri cadet stumbled and went down hard. Mason was there immediately, hauling him up, checking joints with quick practiced hands. Can you walk? Mason asked. The cadet nodded, teeth clenched. Then walk, Mason said. Lean on me. No encouragement, no reassurance, just direction. As night fell, the wind returned in short, sharp bursts, not strong enough to knock them down, but enough to drain warmth. The sky cleared just enough for the stars to burn cold and bright. They found a shallow depression near a rock face that blocked the worst of the wind. Luke stopped and raised a hand. "We stop here," he said. Roas looked around. No shelter, no cover beyond stone and shadow. Luke pulled out the remaining thermal sheets and rationed them with care, layering them not as blankets but as windbreaks, wedged between rock and packs. Mason had the cadets sit back to back in pairs, sharing heat, forcing stillness. Roas watched the methodical way they worked and felt something close to shame. He had laughed earlier. He had dismissed this as myth. The humans were not dramatic. They were efficient under conditions where efficiency mattered most. Hours passed in fragments. Someone vomited from stress and cold. Mason cleaned it without comment. Someone else began to shake uncontrollably. Luke adjusted positioning and forced slow breathing until it stopped. Roas stayed awake, watching, listening, feeling the slow burn in his muscles and the ache in his joints. He realized the humans were hurting too. They were just treating it as expected input rather than a crisis. Near dawn, the wind eased again. Luke checked the horizon and nodded. "Another push," he said. "Then we rest." They moved as the light returned, gray and thin. The extraction marker finally came into view by mid-morning. A tall signal mast, half buried in dust, but still active. A few cadets laughed weakly when they saw it. Roas did not. He felt only relief and a heavy sense of recalibration. They reached the marker and activated the beacon. The dropship response came back almost immediately. Extraction inbound. Rose slumped against the rock and let himself sit. Mason crouched nearby, breathing hard now that the urgency had faded. Luke removed his helmet and wiped his face, leaving streaks of dust and blood where the stone had cut him earlier. Roas looked at them both. "I was wrong," he said quietly. Neither human answered right away. Then Mason spoke, not unkindly. "Storms do not care what you believe, sir." Luke added, "We just keep moving." Roas nodded. He had no argument left, only understanding. The myth had never been about endurance as spectacle. It had been about continuation when plans failed, and Kestrel 4 had taught him that lesson in full. The dropship arrived low and careful, its engines fighting the thin, unpredictable winds that still skittered across the ground. When the ramp lowered, med crews moved out fast, efficient and quiet. They checked cadets in order of severity, tagging injuries, handing out heat packs, loading stretchers. No one argued, no one boasted. They were too tired for that. Instructor Kellen Roas stood near the extraction marker and watched his cadets board. Some limped, some leaned on each other. All of them were alive. That fact sat heavy in his chest. When Mason Carter reached the ramp, a medic tried to stop him. "You are bleeding," she said, pointing to his forearm. Mason looked down, surprised, as if the cut had only just occurred to him. "Yeah, guess I am." "Sit," she ordered. He sat without complaint. Luke Navarro followed, helmet tucked under his arm. He paused when he reached Roas. "You coming?" Luke asked. Roas realized he was still standing in the dust, hands empty, doing nothing useful. "Yes," he said. "I am." Inside the dropship, the noise was softer, controlled. The kind of sound that meant systems were working again. Cadets slumped into seats. Some closed their eyes immediately. Others stared at nothing. Roas remained standing until the last one was strapped in. Only then did he sit. The flight back to the Academy outpost was silent except for med readouts and engine hum. No one wanted a debrief yet. Words would not help. When they landed, daylight had fully returned. Kestrel 4 looked calm again, almost innocent, as if the storm had been a temporary inconvenience rather than a lesson written in pain and grit. Roas knew better now. The formal debrief happened 2 days later. Clean room, dry air, fresh uniforms. The cadets sat straighter, but the edge was still there. Something had changed in how they listened. Roas stood at the front of the room and activated the recorder. "This is the final assessment for Field Exercise 12, he said. He paused. "Instructor failure," he continued. "Primary." A few cadets looked up in surprise. Roas did not soften it. "I dismissed environmental risk based on forecast reliability. I relied on doctrine designed for cooperative terrain. I underestimated adaptive endurance." His gaze moved to Mason and Luke, seated apart, both quiet. "I treated human resilience as exaggeration," Roas said. I laughed. No one laughed now. Roas took a breath. When the storm destroyed every shelter and every plan, two cadets shifted from compliance to survival, leadership without instruction. He turned slightly toward the display and brought up still images taken from suit cams during the storm. Not dramatic ones, just moments. A hand gripping a harness, a body wedged into stone, a thermal sheet repurposed as a wind baffle. These are not heroic acts, Roas said. They are practical ones. He looked back at the room. Human endurance is not about standing still and suffering, he said. It is about movement when stopping feels safer. It is about adaptation when structure fails. It is about continuing when the exercise stops being one. A cadet raised a hand. Sir, why did the humans not collapse like the rest of us? Roas answered honestly. They wanted to. They simply treated that desire as irrelevant. That answer settled into the room. Roas concluded the debrief with a revision order. Future field exercises on hostile worlds would change. Shelter loss would be assumed. Forecast failure would be assumed. Plans would be graded on how well they adapted after collapse, not before. Human cadets would no longer be segregated for endurance observation. They would be integrated as baseline references for failure state function. After the session, Roas found Mason and Luke outside the hall. They stood near a railing overlooking the training grounds, quiet as ever. I owe you both an apology, Roas said. Luke shrugged. Storms happen. Mason nodded. People learn, or they do not. Roas managed a small, tired smile. I learned. He hesitated, then added, I will not laugh again. Luke looked at him for a moment. Good. Weeks later, Field Exercise 12 became required reading, not because of the storm, because of the response. Cadets learned that endurance was not measured in hours survived under ideal conditions. It was measured in decisions made when conditions erased comfort, shelter, and certainty. The Academy did not start praising humans as invincible. It did something more uncomfortable. It started teaching others to endure like them. Kellen Roas updated his lecture notes. He removed the slide where he had once written, Human Endurance, Myth. He replaced it with a single line. Endurance is what remains after plans fail. On Kestrel 4, the storms continued as they always had. But the Academy no longer sent cadets there to test shelters. It sent them to test whether they would keep moving when nothing else held. And no instructor laughed anymore when humans were mentioned. They remembered the day the Deathworld storm hit, and who carried everyone else through it.